Let me say this directly. If the United States and Iran move toward a real understanding, it will not be just another diplomatic episode filed away in Washington, Tehran, or Jerusalem. It could become one of those rare moments when the strategic map of the Middle East begins to shift before most of the world fully realizes what is happening. For months, the region has been defined by confrontation, military signaling, economic pressure, intelligence competition, political warnings, and the constant fear that one miscalculation could trigger something far larger than anyone intended. At the center of that tension have stood three powers whose decisions carry consequences far beyond their borders: the United States, Iran, and Israel. Now imagine the implications if Washington and Tehran begin exploring a framework that lowers tensions, establishes communication, and creates even a limited form of strategic restraint. That would not simply affect the bilateral relationship between the United States and Iran. It would move through the entire region. It would alter Israeli calculations, shape Arab responses, influence global powers, affect energy markets, and potentially redefine the balance of power in the Middle East. That is why the central question is not only whether the United States and Iran can reduce tensions. The deeper question is this: if they do, what happens to Israel? And beyond Israel, what happens to the wider architecture of power across the Middle East? This is what makes the issue so consequential. Israel and Iran have never treated each other as normal political competitors. Their conflict has been strategic, ideological, military, and regional all at once. It has been fought through influence, deterrence, intelligence operations, covert action, proxy networks, missile capability, regional alliances, and competing visions for the future order of the Middle East. For decades, Israeli leaders have viewed Iran as one of the most serious, long-term threats to the country's security. That view is not confined to a single political camp. Tactics may differ from one government to another, but the underlying concern has remained remarkably consistent. Iran is not simply another rival state. In the eyes of much of Israel's security establishment, it represents a challenge that touches nearly every layer of national defense, from military planning to intelligence priorities to regional diplomacy. At the same time, the United States has remained Israel's most important external partner, while also moving through cycles of confrontation, negotiation, pressure, sanctions, deterrence, and diplomatic exploration with Iran. That has always produced an unstable balance. Washington has had to reassure Israel, limit Iranian influence, manage Arab partnerships, prevent regional escalation, protect energy flows, and avoid being drawn into a wider war, often all at the same time. That balancing act has never been simple, and it becomes even harder when diplomacy enters the picture. Because whenever reports emerge that Washington and Tehran may be exploring a new understanding, the reaction inside Israel is immediate. Political leaders, military planners, intelligence officials, and policy analysts begin asking the same urgent questions. Would such an arrangement reduce the risk of a broader regional war? Would it create new channels for crisis management? Would it slow escalation? Or would it ease pressure on Iran without resolving the deeper concerns that have shaped Israeli strategy for years? Supporters of diplomacy argue that communication, even between adversaries, is preferable to permanent confrontation without guardrails. Their view is that agreements do not need to solve every dispute to be useful. They only need to reduce uncertainty, create monitoring mechanisms, establish consequences, and provide decision-makers with options other than retaliation, escalation, and force. This is the logic of controlled de-escalation. It is imperfect, often frustrating, and rarely dramatic in the moment, but it can prevent crises from becoming wars. Yet within significant parts of Israel's political and security establishment, the concern is very different. The worry is that diplomacy can create the appearance of stability without actually removing the underlying danger. Critics fear that if the enforcement mechanisms are weak, if the commitments are vague, or if the consequences for violations are unclear, then a diplomatic framework can buy time without buying security. From that perspective, The danger is not simply a bad agreement. It is a misleading sense of reassurance. This concern is not new. Israeli leaders across multiple eras have tended to judge negotiations involving Iran not by the tone of the announcements, but by the structure of the arrangement itself. What is being limited? What is being monitored? Who enforces compliance? What happens if commitments are ignored? How does the agreement affect the regional balance of power in practical terms rather than rhetorical ones? Those are the questions that matter most in Jerusalem. And that brings us to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the broader Israeli leadership. For them, this is not only a diplomatic question, it is a strategic test. Israel's alliance with the United States remains a foundation of its foreign and security policy. But that does not mean Israeli leaders will automatically interpret diplomatic progress with Iran the same way Washington does. This is where alliances become complicated. Two governments can remain close, share intelligence, cooperate militarily, and still perceive risk differently. Washington may see engagement with Iran as a way to reduce instability and buy time. Jerusalem may see the same process as a source of danger unless it comes with strict safeguards and credible enforcement. Both views can exist simultaneously, and both can shape policy. Inside Israel, the debate would likely grow sharper the moment concrete details begin to emerge. Some voices would argue that no diplomatic development should weaken Israel's security posture or deterrence framework. Others would argue that a changing regional environment may require reassessment, adaptation, and a careful search for strategic openings. Between those positions lies the real policy struggle: how to preserve core security interests while adjusting to a regional order that may no longer operate according to familiar assumptions. And Israel will not be debating this in isolation. Arab governments across the region will be watching just as carefully. Some may welcome reduced tensions between Washington and Tehran if they believe it lowers the risk of a wider regional confrontation. Others may be more cautious, waiting to see whether the understanding is serious, enforceable, and durable. In the Middle East, every announcement is judged twice, first by what it says, and then by whether it survives contact with reality. That uncertainty is what makes this moment potentially transformative. The consequences are not only military and diplomatic, they are also economic. The Middle East remains central to global energy supplies, shipping lanes, trade routes, infrastructure corridors, and investment confidence. When tensions rise, markets react. When escalation seems possible, insurance costs climb, investors hesitate, and governments prepare for disruption. When diplomacy creates predictability, even limited predictability, the economic atmosphere changes. This matters well beyond the region. Europe watches because energy security and migration pressures are tied to stability in the Middle East. Asian economies watch because trade routes and energy imports depend on uninterrupted regional flows. Global financial markets watch because the Middle East is not a peripheral arena. It is a strategic hinge connecting energy, commerce, geopolitics, and international risk. The consequences of instability rarely remain local. Still, no serious analyst should pretend that diplomacy automatically resolves the deeper disputes. Agreements do not erase decades of rivalry, suspicion, and strategic competition. At best, they create a structure within which conflict can be managed. Their success depends on implementation, verification, political will, internal discipline, and the capacity of governments to sustain commitments after the headlines fade. That is why the next phase matters more than the announcement itself. Diplomatic openings can create hope, but they can also create illusions. If the framework is followed, if violations are addressed, and if communication channels remain active, then many governments may welcome a more predictable environment. But if enforcement collapses, if interpretations diverge, or if domestic political pressure overwhelms strategic discipline, the region could quickly enter another cycle of mistrust and escalation. The Middle East has repeatedly shown that assumptions can unravel very quickly. Leaders make plans, then events intervene. Internal politics shift, regional rivals test boundaries, external powers recalculate. A diplomatic breakthrough can become a strategic pause, and a strategic pause can become a prelude to a new confrontation if the underlying issues remain unresolved. For Israel, the coming period could require choices that shape its strategic direction for years. Israeli policymakers may have to decide how to protect what they consider essential security interests, while adapting to a region where diplomacy, not only deterrence, begins altering the terrain. They may also have to ask whether the old framework of pressure and isolation remains sufficient in a Middle East that is becoming more economically interconnected and diplomatically fluid. Washington faces a parallel challenge. American policymakers must reassure Israel, maintain regional partnerships, pursue diplomatic goals with Iran, protect military and economic interests, and avoid sending signals of weakness or inconsistency. That is a demanding balancing act in any environment. In today's Middle East, with its overlapping crises and competing powers, it becomes even more difficult. Iran, too, would face pressure on multiple fronts. Any diplomatic movement with the United States creates expectations, obligations, domestic scrutiny, and regional suspicion. Tehran would be judged not only by what it says, but by what it does, and not only by Washington, but by Israel, Arab governments, global markets, and its own internal constituencies. Diplomatic openings can create opportunities, but they also create exposure. The moment expectations rise, so does the cost of failure. But the story does not stop there. In fact, that is where the larger transformation begins. Because a possible understanding between the United States and Iran is not just about those two countries. It is unfolding inside a Middle East that is already changing in deeper ways. And once you widen the lens, another question emerges with enormous force. If the region is entering a new phase, who will shape its future balance of power? This is where China and Russia become essential to the story. To understand the significance of any U.S. Iran understanding, you have to recognize that the Middle East today is not the Middle East of a decade ago. Traditional alliances still matter. Security fears still matter. Old rivalries have not disappeared. But alongside those realities, new economic partnerships, new infrastructure strategies, new technology relationships, and new diplomatic calculations are producing a much more complex order. For much of the modern era, the United States occupied a uniquely dominant position in the Middle East. American military power, diplomatic reach, financial influence, energy interests, and security guarantees gave Washington a central role in many of the region's defining outcomes. From crisis management to alliance systems, from conflict containment to regional deterrence, the United States often stood at the center of the external power structure. That influence has not vanished. The United States still has major military capabilities in the region, long-standing partnerships with key governments, and an unmatched security presence. But many analysts now describe the Middle East as increasingly multipolar. That means the region is no longer shaped by one outside power alone. Several major powers are now pursuing influence simultaneously, and regional governments are learning how to navigate among them. China is perhaps the clearest example of this shift. Beijing's approach to the Middle East has been driven less by military alliances and more by trade, infrastructure, investment, industrial cooperation, technology, and long-term connectivity. Over the last 2 decades, China has expanded its relationships with countries across the region, including governments with very different political systems and strategic interests. The logic is straightforward. China is one of the world's largest energy consumers, and the Middle East remains vital to global energy supplies. Stable ties with energy-producing states are therefore essential to Beijing's long-term planning. But energy is only part of the story. China also sees the region as a crossroads linking Asia, Africa, and Europe. Shipping lanes, ports, logistics corridors, industrial zones, digital networks, and commercial routes all pass through the Middle East. If Beijing wants to expand global connectivity and economic reach, it cannot ignore this region. That gives China a distinctive kind of flexibility. Unlike powers whose role in the Middle East is defined primarily through security commitments or military intervention, Beijing often presents itself first as an economic partner. That does not mean its presence is apolitical. Far from it. Economic engagement can create long-term political influence. Infrastructure can shape alignment. Technology partnerships can affect strategic dependence. But the form of Chinese influence is often different. It arrives through development, capital, markets, supply chains, and connectivity. That matters because it allows China to maintain constructive relations with multiple regional actors at once, including actors that distrust one another. Rather than selecting only one side in the region's rivalries, Beijing often seeks to build parallel relationships across competing capitals. That approach can be frustrating to countries that want clearer alignments, but it gives China room to maneuver. It can deepen trade with one state, expand technology cooperation with another, and pursue energy agreements with a third, all while minimizing entanglement in some of the region's most explosive disputes. Over time, that form of engagement produces more than commercial ties. It produces political weight. The deeper the dependence on investment, infrastructure, industrial cooperation, logistics, telecommunications, and capital, the harder it becomes to separate economics from strategy. In today's world, influence rarely travels through only one channel. It moves through ports, data, finance, energy, construction, platforms, and standards. China understands that. Russia is pursuing a different path, but one that is equally important. Moscow's influence in the Middle East has often been tied more directly to security, military affairs, diplomatic intervention, and strategic positioning. Russia has shown a willingness to engage where other powers hesitate, to support key partners under pressure, and to ensure that its voice cannot be ignored in major regional calculations. For Moscow, the Middle East offers several advantages. It provides access to strategic geography. It creates room for power projection beyond Russia's immediate neighborhood. It reinforces Russia's image as a major international actor. It opens opportunities in energy, defense, trade, and political influence. And it gives Moscow leverage in its broader competition with other global powers. This requires a particular kind of diplomacy. The Middle East is not a region where one relationship automatically secures the others. It is a landscape of overlapping rivalries, shifting partnerships, sectarian tensions, domestic instability, and competing security priorities. Any outside power seeking influence must learn to operate across contradiction. Russia has tried to do exactly that: maintain communication with multiple governments, remain relevant in crises, and position itself as a power that cannot be easily excluded. China and Russia, in different ways, are both adapting to a Middle East where older assumptions no longer fully explain the strategic landscape. There was a time when discussions about power in the region focused mainly on military alliances and ideological blocs. Those elements still matter, but they are no longer sufficient. Today, economic corridors, digital infrastructure, technology ecosystems, energy transitions, supply chains, financial networks, and logistical connectivity are just as important to geopolitical influence. And the Middle East sits at the center of all of those trends. Its geography links major markets. Its waterways remain vital to trade. Its energy resources remain globally significant, even as the world slowly diversifies its energy mix. Its sovereign wealth, industrial planning, infrastructure ambitions, and modernization agendas attract outside powers looking for opportunity and strategic access. That ensures that competition in the region will not disappear. It will evolve. The rise of a more multipolar Middle East does not mean old alliances vanish. It means regional governments are diversifying. Many states now seek to maintain several major relationships at once. They may rely on the United States for security cooperation, trade heavily with China, engage Russia on specific strategic questions, and still maintain strong ties with Europe and Asia in finance, education, technology, and investment. This is not inconsistency. It is deliberate strategic hedging. Regional governments want flexibility. They want to avoid overdependence on any single external actor. They want access to capital, markets, defense systems, logistics, advanced technology, diplomatic support, and development opportunities. In a fragmented international system, survival increasingly depends on options. But options come with complexity. Economic projects carry strategic partnerships. Technology partnerships can shape future intelligence and security environments. Infrastructure investments can affect long-term political alignment. Energy cooperation can become leverage. Every major external relationship now reaches beyond its own sector. Trade affects diplomacy. Finance affects sovereignty. Technology affects defense. Connectivity affects power. This is especially visible in energy. The global energy system is changing, but slowly and unevenly. Renewable technologies are growing, yet traditional hydrocarbons remain central to the world economy. Middle Eastern countries sit at the heart of this transition. Many are pursuing ambitious diversification agendas in manufacturing, logistics, tourism, finance, advanced industry, and digital development. China has become a major participant in several of these efforts. Russia remains active through energy coordination and strategic engagement. Western states continue to provide investment, innovation, finance, education, and advanced systems. The result is a region where influence is built through multiple channels at once. Technology is another major arena. Artificial intelligence, cyber capability, digital platforms, data infrastructure, smart logistics, telecommunications networks, and advanced manufacturing are no longer secondary issues. They are core instruments of national power. Governments across the Middle East understand this. They are investing heavily in modernization, digital transformation, and industrial strategy. Outside powers that can offer capital, expertise, training, markets, or technology gain not only contracts, but also lasting influence. Security, of course, remains central. No amount of economic modernization removes the importance of defense, deterrence, intelligence cooperation, missile capability, and strategic stability. The United States still possesses unmatched military reach in the region. Russia remains relevant through defense ties and strategic diplomacy. China, while historically less military-focused in the Middle East, has gradually increased security-related engagement as its interests expand. Here is the deeper point. Even these competing powers share some overlapping interests. They all benefit in different ways from stable shipping routes, functioning energy markets, avoidable wars being avoided, and regional crises remaining contained. That does not erase competition, but it does create limited space for parallel interests. And that space matters. Because if Washington and Tehran move toward even a partial understanding, China and Russia will be watching very closely. Reduced tensions could open opportunities for trade, infrastructure planning, investment, and diplomacy. Renewed instability would raise risks, disrupt markets, and complicate long-term regional strategy. Neither Beijing nor Moscow sees the region only through ideology. Both view it through power, access, leverage, and opportunity. Public expectations inside the Middle East also shape this new order. Across many countries, populations increasingly prioritize jobs, higher living standards, technology, modernization, and economic opportunity. Security still matters deeply, but governments are also expected to deliver development. That changes the calculus. External powers that help produce growth, connectivity, and modernization gain influence in ways that go beyond military signaling. This is why the emerging regional system looks less like a rigid Cold War map and more like a dense web of overlapping partnerships. Countries are not always choosing one bloc against another. They are building portfolios of relationships. They are combining economic ties with one power, security cooperation with another, diplomatic coordination with a third, and issue-specific partnerships with others. This is the new strategic environment into which Israel must adapt. And that brings us back to the original question. If the United States and Iran reduce tensions, even modestly, Israel will not only be watching the text of an agreement, it will be watching the behavior of the region around it. How do Arab governments respond? Do they see opportunity or danger? Does reduced U.S. Iran tension make them more confident or more cautious? How do markets react? Does China move faster on infrastructure and economic engagement? Does Russia seek new diplomatic openings? Does the regional balance begin to change quietly through economics, signaling, and strategic repositioning, even before any dramatic public announcement? For Israel, that is the real challenge. The issue is not only whether Washington and Tehran can talk. The issue is whether a new diplomatic environment begins to reshape the broader architecture of regional power in ways that reduce Israel's room for maneuver or force it to reconsider old assumptions. This does not mean Israel becomes irrelevant. Far from it. Israel remains a major military power, a technological center, an intelligence actor of exceptional capability, and a state with deep relationships in Washington and growing connections elsewhere in the region. But power in a changing order depends not only on strength, it also depends on adaptation. If the Middle East is indeed moving toward a more fluid, multipolar, economically interconnected structure, then every major actor will need to think differently. Israel will need to consider how to preserve deterrence while engaging a region that may be recalibrating around diplomacy and development. The United States will need to reconcile its security commitments with a more distributed regional order. Iran will need to decide whether it can convert tactical diplomacy into broader strategic legitimacy. Arab governments will continue trying to maximize flexibility without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. China and Russia will keep seeking influence through the channels where they see the greatest advantage. That is why this moment deserves close attention. World order rarely changes in one dramatic instant. More often, it changes through a series of openings, recalculations, hedges, corridors, arrangements, and decisions that appear technical until history reveals how consequential they were. A diplomatic framework here, an infrastructure deal there, a shift in deterrence language, a new trade route, a quiet security understanding, a changed investment pattern, a subtle realignment of priorities. That is how strategic transformation actually happens. So yes, the headline may focus on a possible understanding between the United States and Iran, but the larger story is much bigger than that. The real story is the future architecture of power in the Middle East. Will the region move toward a more stable but more competitive multipolar order? Will diplomacy create breathing room or merely postpone another confrontation? Will Israel find that reduced tension between Washington and Tehran strengthens regional stability, or that it complicates its own long-term security planning? Will Arab states use the moment to diversify even further? Will China deepen its economic reach? Will Russia preserve its strategic relevance? Will the United States remain the dominant external actor or become the leading actor inside a more crowded field? Those are not abstract questions. They are the questions that will shape the next phase of Middle Eastern politics. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: when power begins to move, it rarely announces itself in full. It shifts through diplomacy before doctrine catches up. It moves through economics before the military map changes. It appears in hedging behavior before it appears in formal alliances. It grows inside strategic ambiguity before it becomes visible as a new order. That is why this moment matters. If Washington and Tehran are truly exploring a new understanding, then Israel is not just observing a diplomatic file, it is watching a possible turning point. So are Arab capitals, so are Beijing and Moscow, so are markets, investors, and every government that depends on stability in the wider region. Because if the Middle East is entering a new phase, the central struggle will not only be about preventing war, it will be about shaping the system that comes next. Who will define the terms of stability? Who will control the key corridors of trade and technology? Who will build the partnerships that matter most? Who will convert influence into lasting advantage? And who will adapt quickly enough to avoid being trapped by assumptions that belonged to an earlier era? That is the real question beneath the headlines. Study this moment carefully, because history often moves in exactly this way. Not all at once, but through diplomatic openings, strategic caution, economic corridors, political recalculation, and decisions that seem temporary until they redefine the balance of power. That is how regions change. That is how alliances are tested. And that is how power moves.